Welcome, night traveler. Settle in and let the day loosen its grip. Tonight we're slipping behind the marble of ancient Rome to a quieter, lamplit world, the hidden economy of sex. No shock or sensation here, just a careful, non-graphic journey through lupanaria and taverns, the lives of meretrices and courtesans, the ledgers, laws, and whispered survival that turned intimacy into industry. We'll wander the Subura by oil light, read graffiti that worked like ancient reviews, hear why Rome taxed desire, and meet the women who turned a half hour into rent, into safety, sometimes into freedom. If you're listening in bed, soften your breath. In and out. Tell me where you're tuning in from and what time your night has reached. It's a quiet joy to see this sleepy circle scatter across the map. If these gentle deep dives help you unwind, you're welcome to subscribe so you don't miss the next slow chapter. For now, dim the room, let the blankets grow heavy, and step with me into Rome's after hours, where coins clicked, lamps flickered, and human resilience learned to speak softly. In ancient Rome, sex work was a visible and regulated part of urban life. Women involved in this trade could be found in a variety of settings, from dimly lit taverns to grand establishments in busy districts, and even in the private chambers of wealthy men. Roman society had a complex relationship with prostitution. It was legal and openly practiced, yet it carried a strong social stigma. Those who worked as prostitutes were considered infames, a legal category that marked them as people of lower moral standing, alongside actors and gladiators. This label meant they lost certain legal rights, such as the ability to accuse others in court or to inherit property in some circumstances. The Roman state did not criminalize prostitution. In fact, the government saw it as a necessary outlet for male sexual desires, which, according to their moral reasoning, helped protect respectable women, particularly wives of elite families, from sexual advances. This utilitarian view was deeply rooted in Roman ideas of social order. However, women who entered the profession often did so out of economic need, lack of family support, or as a result of enslavement. Many prostitutes in Rome were slaves owned by brothel keepers or private individuals. Their earnings usually went to their owners, though some could eventually save enough to purchase their freedom. The spaces where sex work took place were varied. The most notorious were the lupanaria, brothels that could range from simple single-room structures to large buildings with multiple chambers. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii has given historians vivid details about these establishments. Some rooms had stone beds with mattresses, and the walls were painted with erotic frescoes. Outside, explicit signs or carvings indicated the nature of the business. The cost of services could be as low as a few asses, small copper coins, making sex work accessible to men of different classes. Not all prostitutes worked in brothels. Some operated in taverns, inns, or even on the streets, especially in crowded areas like the Circus Maximus or near the baths. Street prostitutes, known as prostibulae, might solicit clients in public and conduct their business in alleys, rented rooms, or hidden corners. Wealthier courtesans, sometimes called meretrices honestae, could move in higher social circles. These women often cultivated skills in conversation, music, and poetry, attracting clients from the political and literary elite. Although still marked by stigma, their status was higher than that of common street workers. Registration with the authorities was a key aspect of legal sex work. Women who wanted to work as prostitutes had to register with the local ediles, Roman officials who oversaw public morality and market regulation. This process involved declaring one's intention, providing personal details, and being entered into official records. Failure to register could lead to punishment, such as flogging or fines. Registration also made the status of a prostitute permanent in many cases, even if the woman later left the trade. This lasting social mark could affect her ability to marry respectably or regain full legal rights. The clientele for prostitution in Rome came from all walks of life. Soldiers, merchants, freedmen, and senators might all seek services, though elite men were often discreet to protect their reputations. Sexual morality in Rome was primarily concerned with protecting the honor of freeborn male citizens and their families. Men were permitted, even expected, to have sexual relations with prostitutes, slaves, or concubines, as long as they avoided seducing another citizen's wife or corrupting a respectable maiden. For women, however, sexual activity outside marriage was condemned, unless it was in the context of registered sex work. Religion also intersected with prostitution in certain ways. While most Roman religious practices did not directly involve sex work, some foreign cults, such as the worship of Venus Erycina in certain locations, were associated with sacred prostitution, though historians debate the extent and nature of these rituals. In general, prostitution was seen as morally questionable but socially useful, fitting into the Roman worldview where class and legal status mattered more than personal sexual choices. For many women, sex work in Rome was a life of vulnerability. They were exposed to the risks of disease, violence from clients, and exploitation by pimps or brothel owners. Laws offered little protection, and the infame status meant they could not expect justice in the same way other citizens could. Despite this, some women managed to improve their circumstances, buying freedom if they were slaves, acquiring property, or even retiring into modest comfort. A few became famous for their beauty, wit, or connections, their names preserved in Roman literature and inscriptions.
The economic structure of prostitution in ancient Rome was layered and closely linked to the city's broader economy. Sex work was not only a personal service, but also a commercial enterprise that generated steady income for those who managed it. Brothel owners, called lenones, male, or lene, female, often operated as business people, owning or renting property specifically for this trade. They employed both free women and enslaved women, setting prices according to beauty, youth, skill, and the clientele they targeted. In many cases, lenones also acted as intermediaries, arranging meetings between courtesans and wealthy clients for a commission. Slavery played a central role in the sex trade. Enslaved women and sometimes men were trained and presented in ways designed to attract customers. Owners might invest in grooming, clothing, and even education for their slaves to make them more desirable, particularly if they were marketed as high-class courtesans. For the enslaved, sex work was not a choice. It was labor imposed by their masters, and refusal was rarely an option. Earnings from their services went directly to the owner, though in rare cases, an enslaved prostitute might be allowed to keep a portion, building a fund known as a peculium that could be used to buy freedom. Street prostitution offered another economic model. Some women operated independently, renting small rooms or using public spaces where they could solicit clients. They might work near popular entertainment sites like amphitheaters, baths, or markets, where large crowds ensured a constant flow of potential customers. Independent prostitutes had more control over their earnings than those in brothels, but they also faced greater dangers, including harassment, theft, and police crackdowns if they were unregistered. Prices for sexual services varied widely. Literary sources and graffiti from Pompeii show that common prostitutes might charge just 2 or 3 asses, the cost of a loaf of bread or a cup of wine. More exclusive courtesans could demand sums equivalent to several days' wages for an ordinary laborer. These elite women sometimes negotiated longer-term arrangements with patrons, providing companionship, entertainment, and discretion. For the wealthy men who could afford them, such relationships carried a certain prestige, though always within the limits imposed by social norms. Archaeological discoveries have provided some of the most vivid evidence of how prostitution operated in ancient Rome. In Pompeii, the famous lupanar, a 2-story brothel, contains preserved rooms with stone beds, erotic frescoes above the doorways, and narrow corridors leading to small chambers. The art often depicted sexual acts, perhaps as advertisements or as entertainment for waiting clients. Inscriptions scratched into the walls include names, prices, and boasts from clients and workers alike, offering a rare and candid glimpse into the voices of people otherwise absent from written history. In the port city of Ostia, archaeologists have identified taverns and inns that likely doubled as places for prostitution. These establishments catered to sailors, merchants, and travelers, groups known for seeking temporary pleasures while far from home. The combination of alcohol, music, and available sex created spaces where the lines between entertainment and commercial sex blurred. In many cases, sex work was integrated into the hospitality industry, with tavern keepers employing prostitutes as part of the attraction for customers. While the Roman state did not criminalize prostitution, it did seek to control it. Regulations ensured that prostitutes were registered and that their status was clear to potential clients. This was partly to prevent respectable women from being mistaken for sex workers and partly to maintain the moral hierarchy the Romans valued. Prostitutes were required to wear certain clothing or hairstyles in some regions, marking them as distinct from virtuous matrons. Such visual cues reinforced their separation from respectable society. Cultural attitudes toward prostitutes were contradictory. On one hand, Roman moralists often wrote about them with contempt, portraying them as symbols of moral decay. On the other hand, satirists and poets sometimes depicted them with humor, sympathy, or even admiration for their wit and survival skills. Writers like Martial and Juvenal made frequent references to prostitutes, sometimes mocking their clients more harshly than the women themselves. Elite courtesans could even become muses for poets, their beauty and personality immortalized in verse. The legal concept of infamia remained the most significant barrier for prostitutes who wished to leave the trade and reintegrate into respectable society. Even if a woman retired, married, or acquired wealth, her past as a registered prostitute could follow her for life. Inheritance laws, marriage restrictions, and social prejudice all worked against her. This permanence of status was one reason some women avoided official registration, preferring to operate in a legal gray zone despite the risks. Prostitution in ancient Rome also intersected with migration and cultural diversity. Many sex workers were not Roman by birth, but came from across the empire, from Gaul, Greece, North Africa, and the eastern provinces. Their foreignness could be an advantage, as exotic features and accents often attracted Roman clients seeking novelty. However, it also made them more vulnerable, as they might lack local networks of support and be dependent on brothel owners or pimps for survival.
The world of prostitution in ancient Rome was not limited to women. While female sex workers formed the largest and most visible group, the trade also included men and individuals who today might be considered transgender or gender nonconforming. Roman sexual culture was shaped less by modern notions of sexual orientation and more by ideas about dominance, social status, and citizenship. As long as a freeborn Roman male took the active role in sexual acts, his reputation remained intact. The social stigma was primarily attached to those in the passive role, whether male or female. Male prostitutes, known as exaleti or syniadi, though these terms could carry different connotations, often catered to other men but could also serve female clients. Many were slaves or freedmen, working in brothels or offering their services independently in public baths, taverns, or the streets. Like their female counterparts, male sex workers were classified as infames and faced the same legal and social restrictions. Their clientele might include wealthy older men seeking youthful partners, travelers looking for companionship, or those drawn to specific ethnic or cultural traits. In addition to male prostitutes, there were individuals who lived and presented themselves in ways that did not align with their birth-assigned gender. Some adopted feminine clothing, hairstyles, and mannerisms, performing in erotic dances or theatrical shows that blurred gender lines. Roman literature and satire sometimes mocked these individuals, yet they also found a place within the broader entertainment and sex industry. The boundaries between performance and sex work were often fluid, especially in contexts where physical intimacy was part of the spectacle. The social hierarchy among prostitutes in Rome was complex. At the bottom were streetwalkers, who worked outdoors or in makeshift spaces with minimal privacy, and often served the poorest clients. Above them were brothel workers, who at least had some shelter and a steady flow of customers, though they were under the control of lenones or lenae. Higher still were tavern prostitutes, who combined sex work with serving food and drink, benefiting from the more social atmosphere of these venues. At the top of the hierarchy were the meretrices honestae, high-class courtesans who could move in elite circles. These women might be well-educated, skilled in music or poetry, and able to engage in refined conversation. Their clients were senators, equestrians, poets, and foreign dignitaries. Relationships with such women could be as much about prestige and intellectual companionship as physical intimacy. While still subject to infamia, some courtesans managed to wield influence through their connections, occasionally even participating in political intrigue. Public entertainments played a significant role in sustaining demand for prostitution. On days of gladiator games, theatrical performances, or religious festivals, Rome's streets filled with crowds from all social classes. These events often brought an influx of visitors from the countryside and other cities, creating a surge in business for prostitutes. Outside the Colosseum and other arenas, sex workers mingled with vendors selling food, drink, and souvenirs, making the atmosphere both festive and transactional. Festivals dedicated to certain deities sometimes had a more direct connection to sexuality. The Festival of Flora, for example, was associated with fertility and featured performances by prostitutes who would dance nude or semi-nude for the crowd. While such events scandalized moralists, they were part of the accepted rhythm of public life in Rome, where pleasure and entertainment were closely linked. Bathhouses were another key venue for sex work. While the primary purpose of these complexes was hygiene and relaxation, they were also social spaces where people mingled freely. Some baths developed reputations as meeting places for sexual encounters, and certain attendants or masseuses were known to offer sexual services for a fee. The anonymity of the baths, combined with their popularity across all classes, made them an ideal location for discreet transactions. Military life also fueled prostitution. Roman legions stationed far from home often attracted camp followers, including prostitutes who traveled with the army or set up businesses near forts and garrison towns. These women might serve soldiers exclusively or also catered to local civilian men. For soldiers, paying for sex was seen as a way to maintain discipline and prevent unrest, a practical measure from the perspective of military commanders. In all of these contexts, prostitution in ancient Rome was deeply intertwined with the city's entertainment culture, its economy, and its systems of power. Sex work adapted to the rhythms of Roman public life, from the grand spectacles of the Colosseum to the intimate encounters arranged in the dim corners of a tavern.
In ancient Rome, prostitution was not only tolerated but legally recognized, and this meant that it fell under a defined legal framework. The Romans were meticulous in matters of law, and they applied this precision even to the sex trade. From the late Republic into the imperial era, the state created specific rules about who could work as a prostitute, where they could operate, and how they had to present themselves. These laws were not designed to protect the dignity or safety of the sex worker in a modern sense, but rather to preserve the moral order as defined by Roman values. At the center of the legal system regulating prostitution was the requirement for registration with the aediles. These officials, part of the city's government, were responsible for overseeing public order, markets, and morality. Any woman or man who wished to become a prostitute had to appear before the aediles and declare their intention. They had to provide their name, age, place of birth, and the type of work they intended to do. Once recorded in the official registers, their legal status changed permanently to that of a meretrix for women, or scordum, a general term for prostitutes sometimes applied to men. This act carried enormous social consequences because it was nearly impossible to reverse. Even if a registered prostitute stopped working, the record remained, and with it came the stigma of infamia for life. Infamia was more than just a bad reputation, it was a legal condition. Under Roman law, those marked as infamous lost certain civil rights. They could not hold public office, serve in the army, or act as a legal witness in court. They were barred from marrying into the senatorial class, and even in lower social ranks, marriage prospects were limited because respectable families avoided alliances with anyone connected to prostitution. For women, this meant that entering the trade was often a one-way path socially, and many who started had no realistic hope of returning to a respectable position in society. Beyond registration, laws also regulated the appearance and conduct of prostitutes. They were often required to wear clothing that distinguished them from freeborn Roman matrons. While respectable married women wore the stola, a long, modest dress that symbolized honor and chastity, prostitutes were forbidden from wearing it. Instead, they might be required to wear the toga muliebris, a garment similar to the male toga, which in this context signaled sexual availability. This distinction in clothing was not merely fashion, it was a form of public labeling, making it impossible for a prostitute to pass as a respectable woman in public without breaking the law. Location was another regulated aspect of the trade. Brothels, or lupanaria, were often located in designated districts, away from temples, government buildings, and elite residential areas. In Rome, certain streets became known for their concentration of sex workers, and over time, these areas developed reputations similar to red light districts in modern cities. Street prostitution was allowed in some public spaces, but could be restricted during major religious festivals or political events to avoid disrupting public morals, though these restrictions were more symbolic than consistently enforced. There were also laws against forcing freeborn Roman citizens into prostitution. In theory, it was illegal for a man to compel his wife, daughter, or other female relative into sex work, but in practice, economic desperation often blurred these lines, and some women were pressured by family members or guardians to enter the trade. Slaves, on the other hand, had no such protection. Their owners had the legal right to use them as prostitutes, and many did so as a source of income. One of the most famous legal cases involving prostitution in Rome comes from the early imperial period and revolves around the figure of a wealthy freed woman named Volumnia Cytheris. She began her life as a slave and a prostitute, but eventually became the mistress of important men, including the famous politician and orator Mark Antony. Her status as a former prostitute was well known, and Roman moralists criticized Antony for publicly appearing with her, considering it a breach of elite decorum. This case illustrates how the stigma of infamia persisted even when a prostitute achieved wealth, freedom, and high-profile lovers. Another significant example is the case of the Emperor Caligula, who, according to ancient historians like Suetonius, blurred the lines between elite women and prostitution by forcing noble women to appear in his palace brothel to entertain guests. While the historical accuracy of such accounts is debated, these stories reflect the Roman fascination and moral anxiety about crossing class boundaries in sexual matters. For the Romans, the real scandal was not prostitution itself, but the idea of high-ranking women being treated like common sex workers. Legal changes over time reflected shifts in Roman political and social priorities. Under the Emperor Augustus, who ruled from 27 BCE to 14 CE, moral legislation known as the Lex Julia aimed to promote marriage and punish adultery. Augustus tolerated prostitution, but sought to restrict sexual relationships between men of senatorial rank and women of dishonorable professions, including prostitutes. The law reinforced the idea that sexual behavior was not just a private matter, but a concern of the state, tied to the stability and purity of the citizen body. Later emperors sometimes took different approaches. The Emperor Tiberius reportedly expelled certain foreign prostitutes from Rome to reduce what he saw as moral corruption, though such measures had little long-term effect. In contrast, the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century CE, influenced by the spread of Christianity, took steps to close some brothels, marking the beginning of a shift toward a more restrictive attitude toward prostitution, though the trade never disappeared entirely. Despite all these regulations, enforcement was uneven. Corruption among ediles meant that some women could work without proper registration by paying bribes, and rich clients could protect favored courtesans from legal consequences. Laws were as much about maintaining appearances and social hierarchy as they were about controlling behavior. For most prostitutes, the reality was that their legal status offered little protection against exploitation, violence, or disease. The intersection of law and prostitution in Rome shows a society that was both pragmatic and deeply hierarchical. The state accepted sex work as a permanent part of urban life, regulated it for the sake of public order, but never granted those in the trade the dignity or rights of full citizens. The laws reinforced a rigid social boundary, one that prostitutes could rarely cross, no matter their earnings or personal connections.
In the vast and bustling social world of ancient Rome, some prostitutes managed to rise above anonymity and secure a place in history, not always through their own writings or voices, but through the accounts of poets, historians, and gossip circulated in the elite circles of the empire. These women, often courtesans of exceptional beauty, intelligence, or charm, could wield influence over powerful men, shaping political alliances, and even playing a role in the cultural life of the city. One of the most famous examples is Cytheris, the stage name of Volumnia Cytheris, a freedwoman and actress who also worked as a courtesan. Born a slave, she was trained in the arts of performance and seduction, skills that helped her attract influential lovers. Among them was Marcus Antonius, better known as Mark Antony, one of the most important political and military figures of the late Republic. Cytheris traveled with him openly, attended public events in his company, and even appeared alongside him in a chariot during military parades, something that shocked conservative Roman opinion. For many, the scandal was not that Antony had a mistress, such relationships were common, but that he flaunted her in public, treating her like a wife or political partner. This challenged the Roman expectation that prostitutes, no matter how high class, should remain in the shadows. Another notable figure was Fausta, the daughter of the famous dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla. While her early life placed her firmly in Rome's aristocracy, ancient sources suggest she engaged in affairs and possible sex work later in life, either as a way to maintain her lavish lifestyle or as a form of rebellion against social constraints. Fausta's example shows that the boundaries between respectable women and sex workers could blur under certain circumstances. Though in her case, Her elite birth shielded her from the full legal and social penalties faced by ordinary prostitutes. In the world of literature, prostitutes often appeared as colorful, clever, and sometimes tragic characters. Roman comedy, especially the plays of Plautus and Terence, frequently featured courtesans as central figures. These stage characters, while fictional, drew from real social types familiar to the audience. They were often portrayed as witty and resourceful, able to manipulate men for money, gifts, or freedom. While the comedic form exaggerated for entertainment, it also reflected a certain admiration for women who could survive, even thrive, in a male-dominated society through intelligence and charm. Poetry, too, preserved the names of real courtesans. The elegiac poets of the late Republic and early Empire, such as Propertius, Tibullus, and Ovid, often addressed their verses to mistresses who may have been courtesans. In these poems, the woman is sometimes idealized as a muse, sometimes criticized for her unfaithfulness or greed. Yet whether praised or blamed, she is always central to the poet's emotional and creative life. This literary attention helped immortalize certain women, though their true selves were often obscured by the fantasies and artistic agendas of the men who wrote about them. Some courtesans became wealthy enough to own property, employ servants, and even patronize the arts. In this way, they could become cultural players, using their resources to support poets, actors, or musicians. While they could never hold public office or wield formal political power, their influence was sometimes felt indirectly through their relationships with senators, generals, or even emperors. In a society where personal networks and patronage were crucial, the favor of a powerful courtesan could be a valuable asset. Yet fame came with risks. The same notoriety that brought a courtesan into elite circles could also make her vulnerable. A change in political fortune for a lover could mean exile, confiscation of property, or even execution, and courtesans often shared in these fates. During times of moral reform or political crisis, high-profile prostitutes could be targeted as symbols of decadence. For example, during the reign of Augustus, his moral legislation, while tolerating prostitution in general, discouraged the public display of courtesans and sought to limit relationships between them and the political elite. Satire was another medium where prostitutes appeared frequently. Writers like Juvenal and Martial used them as symbols of excess, moral decline, or sharp social commentary. Sometimes these satirical portraits mocked the hypocrisy of men who condemned prostitutes publicly but visited them privately. Other times they criticized women who used sex to gain wealth and status. Even in these negative depictions, there was an acknowledgement of the prostitute's agency, her ability to navigate the harsh realities of Roman life and turn them to her advantage. The presence of famous courtesans in public life also fueled gossip in Roman society. News traveled quickly in the city, and rumors about who was sleeping with whom could damage reputations or bolster them, depending on the spin. Courtesans themselves could play this game, selectively sharing information or influencing public perception to protect their interests or those of their patrons. In a city where politics was as much about image as policy, such soft power was not insignificant. In the end, the lives of these women remind us that prostitution in ancient Rome was not a single uniform experience. At one extreme, there were streetwalkers struggling to survive on a few copper coins. At the other, courtesans who dined with generals and poets, leaving their mark on politics and culture. Between these poles existed countless shades of experience, shaped by factors like class, citizenship, education, and personal ambition. The famous names preserved in history are only the visible tip of a much larger social reality, one that was woven deeply into the fabric of Roman life.
Public attitudes toward prostitution in ancient Rome were layered with contradictions. On one hand, prostitution was recognized as a legal profession, tolerated by the state, and even considered by many to be a necessary part of urban life. On the other hand, prostitutes were socially marginalized, burdened with infamia, and excluded from respectable society. This tension reflected the Roman tendency to accept certain practices as useful, while still marking the people involved as morally inferior. For the average Roman man, visiting a prostitute was not considered shameful as long as certain rules were followed. Respectable men could seek sexual services from prostitutes, slaves, or concubines without damaging their own reputations, but only if the encounters were with those of lower social status. The real scandal, in Roman eyes, was not the act itself, but violating the hierarchy by seducing another freeborn citizen's wife, a virgin of respectable family, or anyone of higher status. Sexual morality, therefore, was less about chastity or fidelity in the modern sense, and more about protecting class boundaries and male honor. For women, the situation was very different. A woman who became a prostitute, whether by choice or coercion, entered a socially permanent category of dishonor. Unlike men, women could not engage in casual sexual relations without damaging their reputations. Marriage to a prostitute, especially for a man of high rank, was scandalous and sometimes illegal. The double standard was deeply ingrained in Roman culture, supported both by law and by social expectation. Public opinion toward prostitutes could also vary depending on their position in the hierarchy of sex work. Streetwalkers and brothel workers were often treated with open contempt, their presence tolerated but rarely respected. High-class courtesans, however, might be admired for their beauty, wit, or connections, even if they were still officially marked as infames. Poets, satirists, and gossip could elevate such women into figures of fascination, giving them a degree of cultural recognition that ordinary prostitutes never enjoyed. Religion played an indirect but important role in shaping attitudes toward prostitution. Traditional Roman religion was generally pragmatic and concerned with ritual observance rather than strict personal morality. There was no outright prohibition on prostitution, and some deities were even loosely associated with sexuality and desire. Venus, the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility, had several temples in Rome and throughout the empire. In certain provincial cults, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean, there were reports, sometimes exaggerated, of sacred prostitution, where sexual acts were performed as part of religious rites. However, historians debate whether these practices truly existed in Rome itself, or whether they were more a part of Roman fascination with exotic foreign customs. Despite the lack of strong religious opposition, moralists often linked prostitution with the decline of traditional Roman values. Authors like Cato the Elder lamented the erosion of discipline and modesty, especially among the upper classes, and viewed public sexual commerce as a symptom of moral decay. Satirists like Juvenal used prostitutes as symbols of the city's excesses, contrasting them with an imagined past of rural simplicity and virtue. These criticisms, however, rarely called for the abolition of prostitution. They were more about lamenting social change than demanding reform. Festivals and public celebrations further complicated public attitudes. During certain religious festivals, like the Floralia, prostitutes were allowed, even encouraged, to participate in public performances, sometimes dancing naked or wearing revealing clothes. These events dedicated to the goddess Flora blurred the lines between entertainment, ritual, and sexual display. Moralists were scandalized, but the crowds embraced the spectacle, showing that public attitudes could shift dramatically depending on the context. The rise of Christianity in the later empire began to change these attitudes more fundamentally. Early Christian leaders condemned prostitution as sinful, emphasizing chastity and sexual restraint for both men and women. Church fathers like Augustine wrote about the moral dangers of lust, while others debated whether prostitution should be eradicated entirely or tolerated as a lesser evil
to prevent greater sins like adultery and sexual violence. By the 4th century CE, under emperors like Constantine and Theodosius, some legal restrictions on prostitution became stricter, and Christian morality began to influence imperial policy. Certain brothels were closed, and in some cases, attempts were made to rehabilitate prostitutes by placing them in institutions run by the church. Still, these changes were gradual, and prostitution did not disappear from Roman cities. Even as Christian morality became dominant, the economic and social realities that had sustained prostitution for centuries remained. Men still sought sexual services, and women, often driven by poverty, slavery, or lack of other opportunities, continued to provide them. What changed most was the tone of public discourse. Where earlier Romans saw prostitution as a practical, if morally questionable institution, later Christianized Rome viewed it increasingly as a moral and spiritual problem. In the popular imagination, prostitutes occupied a space between fascination and condemnation. They were necessary but undesirable, celebrated in poetry, yet excluded from polite society, condemned in moral speeches, but sought after in private. This paradox was at the heart of Roman social attitudes toward sex work, and would continue to shape the way later societies inherited and reinterpreted Roman practices.
The prostitution industry in ancient Rome was not just a social or moral phenomenon. It was a significant part of the urban economy, integrated into the broader systems of trade, property ownership, and the institution of slavery. In many ways, prostitution functioned as both a service industry and a commercial enterprise, involving transactions that ranged from the cheapest street encounters to long-term arrangements with high-class courtesans. Because of Rome's vast empire, the supply of sex workers and the demand for their services were both tied to the city's international reach and economic networks. At the most basic level, prostitution generated steady income for those who controlled it, most notably the lenones and leni, the male and female pimps or brothel owners. These individuals acted as managers, landlords, and middlemen. They might own or lease the property where the trade took place, hire or purchase sex workers, often slaves, set prices for services, and handle the financial transactions. For many, this was a profitable business, especially in bustling districts near the Forum, the Circus Maximus, or the city gates where travelers arrived. Brothels paid rent or taxes to property owners, bought supplies such as bedding, oil lamps, and cosmetics, and sometimes bribed local officials to avoid harassment, all of which fed into the urban economy. The cost of services varied widely, and this economic diversity meant prostitution reached almost every layer of Roman society. The cheapest services, often from streetwalkers or women working in taverns, could cost as little as 2 or 3 asses, roughly the price of a loaf of bread. Middle-range prostitutes and regulated brothels might charge a few sesterces, and high-class courtesans could demand gold coins or expensive gifts in exchange for their company. These payments circulated back into the economy through food markets, clothing workshops, and entertainment venues, making prostitution part of the financial bloodstream of the city. Slavery was the backbone of this industry. A large percentage of prostitutes in Rome were slaves, purchased specifically for sexual labor. The Roman slave trade was enormous, fueled by conquest, piracy, and commerce. War captives from Gaul, Greece, North Africa, and the eastern provinces could find themselves sold in Rome's slave markets, with young women and boys fetching particularly high prices if they were considered physically attractive. Slave traders knew that certain ethnic backgrounds, such as Greek or Syrian, could be marketed as exotic and desirable, allowing owners to charge more for their services. Once purchased, these individuals might be trained in sexual techniques, conversation, and even music or poetry to appeal to wealthier clients. For slave prostitutes, earnings almost always went entirely to their owners,
although some were allowed to keep a peculium, a personal fund they could use to buy freedom if they saved enough. This possibility gave a faint hope of escape from the trade, but the price of manumission was often so high that few achieved it without the help of a wealthy lover or patron. Owners could also rent out slaves to other brothel keepers, spreading profits across multiple parties. The economic importance of prostitution extended beyond Rome itself. As the empire expanded, military camps, port cities, and trade hubs all developed prostitution markets to serve soldiers, sailors, and merchants. In port cities like Ostia and Puteoli, prostitutes worked alongside tavern keepers and innkeepers, providing services to travelers from across the Mediterranean. In garrison towns along the frontiers, camp followers, including prostitutes, were part of the unofficial economy that supported the legions. While soldiers were forbidden to marry during active service, they were free to seek sexual relationships with prostitutes, and commanders sometimes tolerated or even encouraged the presence of sex workers to maintain troop morale. Prostitution was also connected to luxury trade. Wealthy courtesans often demanded fine clothing, perfumes, jewelry, and imported delicacies as gifts from their clients. This created business for jewelers, textile merchants, and perfume sellers, many of whom imported their goods from far-flung provinces. Silk from China, spices from India, and incense from Arabia could find their way into the boudoirs of Rome's high-class sex workers, illustrating how global trade networks touched even the most intimate corners of Roman life. Taxes and fees from prostitution also contributed to local revenues, though the extent varied by time and place. In some periods, municipal authorities required brothel owners to pay licensing fees or collect a portion of earnings as a tax. In others, regulation was more informal, relying on bribes to aediles or city guards. Either way, the sex trade was a visible and accepted source of income for the urban economy, even if the official rhetoric about morality and order sometimes painted it in a negative light. From an economic perspective, prostitution in Rome operated much like any other service industry. It adapted to demand, catered to different customer segments, and relied on marketing, location, and reputation to attract clients. Brothels near theaters, gladiator arenas, and bathhouses could charge more during events, just as tavern-based prostitutes benefited from festivals and public holidays. The trade was sensitive to fluctuations in the city's population, booming when soldiers returned from campaigns or when large building projects brought an influx of laborers. Ultimately, prostitution's economic role in ancient Rome was inseparable from its social and political structures. It depended on slavery, benefited from the empire's military and commercial networks, and provided livelihoods, however exploitative, for a wide range of people. From the perspective of the Roman elite, this was a stable, predictable part of urban life, one that could be controlled, taxed, and morally distanced by keeping the workers themselves at the bottom of the social order.
The daily life of a prostitute in ancient Rome depended greatly on her position in the hierarchy of sex work, the type of establishment she worked in, and her personal circumstances. At the lowest end, streetwalkers and tavern prostitutes led a life of constant exposure to the public gaze, working long hours in noisy, sometimes dangerous areas of the city. At the higher end, elite courtesans lived in relative comfort, meeting clients by appointment, often in private residences or luxurious rented rooms. Yet, across all levels, certain realities were shared: a life shaped by irregular hours, physical demands, and the constant need to navigate a world where they had few legal protections. A streetwalker's day often began in the late afternoon and continued well into the night. The streets of Rome, especially in districts known for prostitution, would come alive after dark, lit by oil lamps and bustling with crowds leaving taverns, theaters, and bathhouses. These women stood at corners, leaned from windows, or walk the streets calling out to potential customers. They might use subtle gestures, witty remarks, or even small props like flowers or jewelry to draw attention. Competition was fierce, and securing clients often meant lowering prices or offering extra services. In bad weather, business could drop sharply, adding to the instability of their income. For prostitutes working in brothels, lupanaria, the day might be more structured. Many brothels had opening hours, often beginning around midday and staying open until late at night. The lino or lina, pimp or brothel owner, would assign rooms and set prices. The interior of these establishments was often cramped and dimly lit, with small cubicles or chambers containing a bed, sometimes just a stone platform covered with straw and blankets. Erotic frescoes or wall paintings were common, both as decoration and advertisement. Clients might choose a prostitute based on these images or from a direct introduction by the owner. Work was physically demanding, with multiple clients in a single day and little time for rest between encounters. High-class courtesans had a very different routine. Their workday was more about maintaining relationships, grooming, and cultivating an air of exclusivity. They might spend the morning preparing, bathing, applying cosmetics, arranging their hair, and dressing in fine garments. Meetings with clients could involve long conversations, dining, or entertainment before any sexual activity. These women needed to manage their social networks carefully, balancing the attention of multiple wealthy patrons while avoiding public scandal. While they had more autonomy than brothel workers, their position was still precarious, dependent on the favor of powerful men. Health risks were a constant reality. In an era without modern medicine, sexually transmitted infections, though not understood in the same scientific terms, were common. Some Roman medical writers, like Celsus and Galen, described conditions that likely corresponded to syphilis, gonorrhea, and other diseases, though treatments were often ineffective. Prostitutes might use herbal remedies, ointments, or even wine-based washes as crude attempts at prevention, but their knowledge and resources were limited. Injuries from rough clients, complications from pregnancies, and the physical toll of constant sexual activity added to the dangers. Pregnancy was another significant risk. While some prostitutes used primitive forms of contraception, such as herbal pessaries, sponges soaked in vinegar, or withdrawal, these methods were far from reliable. Unwanted pregnancies could lead to abortions, which were often dangerous and sometimes fatal. For slave prostitutes, children born in this context automatically became the property of the owner, adding to the slaveholder's wealth. For free prostitutes, raising a child could be economically devastating, though some managed to train their daughters for the same profession, creating a generational cycle. Violence was an ever-present threat. The infamy status meant prostitutes had little recourse to the law if they were assaulted, cheated, or otherwise wronged. Clients who refused to pay, physically harmed them, or even killed them could sometimes escape punishment, especially if they were of higher social rank. Brothel owners might offer some protection, but they were just as likely to exploit their workers, using threats or physical force to control them. Street prostitutes were especially vulnerable to attacks from drunken men, thieves, and even corrupt officials demanding bribes or sexual favors. Despite these dangers, some prostitutes developed strategies for self-protection. Working in pairs or groups was one common method, allowing women to watch each other's backs and deter some forms of abuse. Building relationships with regular clients could also provide a degree of security and steady income. In certain neighborhoods, informal networks of prostitutes, tavern keepers, and even sympathetic shopkeepers created small communities where information was shared about dangerous clients, changes in local laws, or opportunities for better work. Daily survival also depended on maintaining one's appearance and health. Prostitutes invested in cosmetics, perfumes, and hair dye, sometimes even bleaching their hair to imitate popular, exotic looks.
Clothing was important, both as a form of advertisement and compliance with legal dress codes. Cheap jewelry and colorful garments could make a woman stand out in a crowd, while elite courtesans used fine fabrics and gold accessories to signal their exclusivity. Bathhouses were important not only for hygiene, but also for networking. Some prostitutes actively sought clients there. Food and lodging varied by status. Street prostitutes might live in shared rooms above taverns or in rented spaces near their work area, sometimes paying a part of their earnings to a landlord who doubled as a pimp. Brothel workers usually lived on the premises, with food provided by the owner, often simple fare, like bread, olives, and watered wine. High-class courtesans could afford private apartments or even houses, with servants to manage their meals and upkeep, though such comfort could vanish quickly if they lost a patron's support. Ultimately, the daily life of a prostitute in ancient Rome was a constant balancing act between survival, self-presentation, and navigating the dangers of a society that used their services while denying them protection or respect. Whether in the shadowed alleys of the Subura, the painted chambers of a lupanar, or the candlelit dining rooms of the elite, these women and men lived lives marked by both resilience and vulnerability, a human reality often obscured by the moral judgments of their time.
The Roman Empire stretched across a vast territory, encompassing not just the city of Rome and the Italian peninsula, but also provinces in Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. This immense geographic diversity meant that prostitution, while following certain basic Roman patterns, took on different forms depending on local culture, economy, and legal traditions. In some places, Roman practices were simply layered on top of pre-existing systems. In others, Roman rule reshaped the trade entirely. Understanding these regional differences reveals how flexible and adaptable the sex industry was within the empire. In the city of Rome itself, prostitution was highly visible and deeply integrated into urban life. The capital's size, wealth, and constant influx of visitors created a thriving market for all forms of sex work. The Subura, a densely populated neighborhood near the Forum, was notorious for its concentration of brothels, taverns, and street prostitutes. Here, the trade was open and bustling, with customers ranging from laborers to senators. Because Rome was the administrative and cultural heart of the empire, it also set the tone for the laws and moral attitudes that shaped prostitution elsewhere. In the port cities of Italy, like Ostia and Puteoli, prostitution was closely tied to maritime trade. Sailors, merchants, and travelers from across the Mediterranean created a transient but lucrative customer base. Brothels often operated near the docks, and many taverns doubled as informal houses of prostitution. The services offered here could be quick and inexpensive for sailors on shore leave, but there were also higher-end courtesans who catered to wealthy merchants and ship owners. The diversity of clients in these ports meant that sex workers often learned multiple languages and adapted their styles to suit foreign tastes. Moving north into Gaul and Germania, prostitution adapted to colder climates, smaller urban centers, and military garrisons. Here, the Roman army played a central role in sustaining the trade. Large forts and military camps were surrounded by canabi, civilian settlements that sprang up to serve the needs of soldiers. Among the shopkeepers, innkeepers, and craftsmen were prostitutes, both free and enslaved, who provided companionship and sexual services. Military commanders tolerated and sometimes even organized prostitution near camps to maintain discipline and morale. In these regions, prostitutes often came from local Celtic or Germanic populations, and their appearance and cultural background were part of their appeal to Roman clients. In the eastern provinces, such as Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt, prostitution intersected with long-standing local traditions. Greek cities had their own history of sex work, including the famous hetairai, high-class courtesans known for their education, charm, and influence. Under Roman rule, these traditions continued, but Roman legal frameworks gradually became more prominent. In cities like Alexandria, prostitution was part of a wider entertainment culture that included music, dance, and theater. Egyptian papyri contain contracts between prostitutes and clients, indicating that in some places the trade could be formalized in ways unusual in the West. In the provinces of the Near East, cultural and religious attitudes varied. Some cities had reputations for openness towards sexuality, while others, influenced by local traditions and later by stricter religious norms, viewed prostitution with greater disapproval. For example, in certain Syrian cities, temples dedicated to goddesses associated with love and fertility were rumored, often by outsiders, to involve sacred prostitution, though modern historians question whether this was more myth than reality. What is clear is that Roman military and commercial presence in these regions created demand, and the trade adapted accordingly. North Africa, especially cities like Carthage and Leptis Magna, developed prostitution markets that reflected both Roman and local Berber Punic traditions. Wealthy patrons might seek exotic dancers and entertainers who also offered sexual services, while street-level prostitution catered to laborers and sailors. The climate allowed for more outdoor solicitation, and marketplaces sometimes doubled as spaces for arranging sexual encounters. In some cases, prostitution was linked to festivals honoring deities such as Tanit, blending local religious traditions with Roman entertainment culture. In all these regions, slavery remained the foundation of much of the trade. Enslaved prostitutes could be purchased locally or imported from other provinces, and their ethnic diversity was often a selling point. Roman law regarding registration and infamia applied throughout the empire, but enforcement was not uniform. In more remote provinces, local officials might ignore registration requirements altogether, especially if the trade was small-scale or if bribes were paid. In cosmopolitan cities like Antioch or Ephesus, the profession could be as organized and regulated as it was in Rome itself. Economic conditions also shaped regional prostitution. In poorer provinces, prices for services were lower, and sex workers might combine prostitution with other forms of labor, such as selling goods in markets or working as entertainers. In wealthier areas, especially in cities with a large elite class, high-status courtesans could thrive, cultivating long-term relationships with patrons who might support them for years. What united all these variations was the adaptability of the trade. Whether in the crowded streets of Rome, the wind-swept frontiers of Britain, or the sunlit ports of the Mediterranean, prostitution found ways to fit into local economies and social systems. Roman control provided a loose framework of law and cultural norms, but within that framework, local traditions, geography, and clientele shaped the daily realities of sex work.
In ancient Rome, prostitution was not only a part of daily urban life, it also occupied a vivid place in the city's imagination, reflected in literature, visual art, and popular entertainment. Roman society may have officially stigmatized sex workers, but the fascination with them permeated the culture, from crude graffiti on brothel walls to polished poetry recited in aristocratic salons. The ways in which prostitutes appeared in these cultural mediums reveal the complex mixture of desire, contempt, humor, and even admiration that surrounded them. Literature provided some of the most enduring images of prostitutes in Rome. Roman comedy, particularly the plays of Plautus and Terence, 3rd to 2nd century BCE, often featured courtesans as central characters. These women were usually portrayed as witty, clever, and resourceful, able to manipulate lovesick young men or greedy pimps to achieve their goals. While the portrayals were exaggerated for humor, they drew upon real social types familiar to audiences. The clever courtesan archetype became a staple of Roman theater, a woman who, despite her marginalized position, could outthink and outmaneuver men. In Roman poetry, prostitutes were both idealized and criticized. Elegiac poets like Propertius, Tibullus, and Ovid frequently addressed poems to mistresses who may have been courtesans, blurring the line between love poetry and transactional relationships. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, the art of love, even offered advice on how to woo women, including those in the sex trade, treating them as part of the broader landscape of Roman romance. Martial, in his epigrams, often mocked clients for their sexual habits, while also portraying prostitutes with a mix of body humor and sharp observation. Juvenal, in his satires, used prostitutes as symbols of moral decay, yet his descriptions are so vivid that they give us a detailed picture of their dress, speech, and behavior. Graffiti and inscriptions offer an even more direct voice. Excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum have revealed hundreds of pieces of graffiti, some advertising services, others boasting about encounters. In the famous Lupanar of Pompeii, erotic frescoes decorated the small rooms, depicting various sexual positions, possibly as visual menus for clients. Some walls bore names of prostitutes and their prices. Others recorded crude jokes or messages from satisfied customers. These informal writings show how deeply embedded prostitution was in the street-level culture of Roman towns. In visual art, prostitutes appeared in both explicit and symbolic forms. Frescoes, mosaics, and pottery often depicted erotic scenes, some of which likely represented professional sex work rather than purely private intimacy. In more subtle artworks, courtesans might be represented as mythological figures, such as Venus or nymphs, blurring the line between divine beauty and human sexuality. Erotic art from the Roman world was not hidden away in private collections. It could appear in dining rooms, baths, and even public buildings, reflecting a more open approach to sexual imagery than in many later societies. Public entertainment also had connections to prostitution. Gladiatorial games, chariot races, and theatrical performances all drew large crowds, creating opportunities for solicitation. Some entertainers, dancers, musicians, and actresses also worked as prostitutes, a connection that Roman audiences recognized. The overlap between performance and sex work was so common that moralists often condemned stage performers and prostitutes in the same breath, classifying them both as infames. In festivals like the Floralia, prostitutes were sometimes invited to perform publicly, dancing and stripping as part of the celebration, temporarily shifting from marginalized figures to central attractions. The symbolism of the prostitute in Roman culture was complex. On one level, she represented indulgence, temptation, and the city's moral weakness, a stock figure in moralizing speeches and satires. On another level, she was a symbol of urban vitality and human pleasure, part of the colorful tapestry that made Rome a cosmopolitan center. In some literary works, the prostitute became a voice of truth, speaking bluntly about the hypocrisy of the elite, or the realities of human desire. This dual image, both degraded and desirable, allowed her to be used in many different narrative roles. Even in myth and legend, echoes of prostitution appeared. Stories of goddesses like Venus, or mortal women like the famous Greek courtesan Phryne, whose fame carried into Roman times, fed into the cultural imagination. Roman authors sometimes reimagined mythological women as courtesans, merging classical storytelling with contemporary urban life. This blending of myth and reality helped normalize the idea of the courtesan as both an object of desire and a social outsider.
The presence of prostitutes in Roman culture also reflects the visual marketing of the time. Just as modern advertising uses imagery to sell products, brothels and individual sex workers in Rome used signs, symbols, and visual cues to attract customers. Even outside of explicitly sexual businesses, imagery of Venus, cupids, and erotic scenes could hint at the availability of sexual services. In the end, Roman literature, art, and popular culture reveal a society that lived with a constant contradiction. Prostitution was legally permitted, yet socially condemned, publicly mocked, yet privately desired. These portrayals kept prostitutes in the public eye, sometimes as objects of ridicule, sometimes as glamorous figures, and often as symbols of the pleasures and dangers of city life. The cultural record ensures that even 2,000 years later, the voices, images, and reputations of these women and men remain part of our understanding of Roman civilization.
By the late Roman Empire, the political, cultural, and religious landscape had begun to shift dramatically. The centuries-old traditions that had tolerated and regulated prostitution were challenged by new moral values, driven in large part by the rise of Christianity. This period, from roughly the 3rd to the 5th century CE, saw profound changes in the legal status, public perception, and organization of sex work. In the earlier imperial era, prostitution had been accepted as a practical necessity, a profession that could be regulated by the state and integrated into the urban economy. The aediles still kept registers of prostitutes, brothels operated openly, and the profession was tied into the rhythms of festivals, theater, and public life. But as Christianity spread through the empire, the moral framework began to shift from a pragmatic Roman approach to a religiously inspired one that emphasized sexual restraint, chastity, and the sanctity of marriage for both men and women. By the reign of Constantine the Great in the early 4th century CE, the change had begun to take legal form. Constantine, the first Christian emperor, is reported to have issued laws closing certain brothels, especially those near churches. While these measures were not uniformly enforced, prostitution was too deeply embedded in the urban fabric to disappear overnight, they signaled a new moral direction. The state began to treat prostitution less as a regulated necessity and more as a social ill that should be reduced or removed. Christian leaders and writers played a key role in this transformation. Figures like Augustine of Hippo argued that while prostitution was sinful, it might still be tolerated to prevent greater evils like adultery or rape, a pragmatic concession reminiscent of earlier Roman thought but framed within Christian theology. Others, such as John Chrysostom, took a harder line, calling for the outright eradication of prostitution and urging Christians to avoid all association with the sex trade. Sermons, letters, and theological treatises began to portray prostitutes not as colorful characters of city life, but as moral victims in need of redemption or as dangerous temptresses leading men into sin. In practical terms, the changing moral climate began to restrict the visibility of prostitution. Brothels in central districts were relocated or closed, and solicitation near churches or public baths was banned in many cities. Legal penalties for pimping became harsher, and some laws sought to protect freeborn women from being forced into the trade. However, the institution of slavery, still strong in the late empire, meant that slave prostitutes remained common, particularly in wealthier households and in the shadows of urban economies. In the provinces, the impact of these changes varied. In some eastern cities where Christianity gained early and strong influence, public prostitution declined quickly, replaced by more hidden forms of sex work. In North Africa and parts of Gaul, however, prostitution continued more openly into the 5th century, especially in port towns and along trade routes. The army, though shrinking in size during the empire's decline, still sustained prostitution in garrison towns, although Christian chaplains often preached against it. By the late 5th century, as the Western Roman Empire collapsed under pressures from internal decay and barbarian invasions, the regulation of prostitution in its traditional Roman form largely disappeared. The centralized authority of the aediles vanished in many cities, and without an organized legal framework, prostitution either became an underground activity or adapted to the laws of new rulers. In some areas, Christian bishops took on the role of moral guardians, establishing charitable institutions to rescue prostitutes and offering them a place in religious communities. In other areas, particularly under pagan or semi-pagan successor kingdoms, prostitution continued in older patterns, though on a smaller scale. The symbolic meaning of prostitution also changed. In earlier centuries, prostitutes could be literary muses, comic figures, or social commentators. By the Christian late empire, they were more often depicted in moral allegories as symbols of sin, repentance, and spiritual transformation. Stories of prostitutes who abandoned their profession to become saints, such as Mary of Egypt, became popular in Christian storytelling, reinforcing the new moral order and presenting redemption as the ultimate goal. This transformation did not mean that prostitution disappeared. Demand for sexual services persisted as it always had, but the open, regulated, and culturally integrated system of the classical Roman world was gone. In its place emerged a more hidden, morally charged, and often criminalized version of sex work that would evolve further in the medieval period. What had once been a legal profession embedded in the daily life of Rome became, in the eyes of the new Christian order, a problem to be solved or a sin to be cleansed. The shift from the Roman to the Christian model of dealing with prostitution reflects a broader change in the way sexuality was viewed. For centuries, Romans had accepted sex work as a practical and inevitable part of life, shaped by class and status, but not bound by notions of universal chastity. The Christian worldview, by contrast, introduced a moral absolutism that judged all sexual acts outside marriage as sinful, fundamentally altering the social space in which prostitution could exist.
From the narrow, dimly lit streets of the Subura to the grand port cities of the Mediterranean, from the noisy taverns of Ostia to the candle-lit rooms of Rome's high-class courtesans, prostitution in the ancient Roman world was woven into the fabric of daily life. It was a profession that thrived in the spaces where pleasure, commerce, and survival intersected. A trade sustained by human desire, economic necessity, and the deep inequalities of Roman society. Over centuries, this profession shaped and was shaped by the empire's laws, economy, and culture. It served the practical needs of a city bursting with soldiers, sailors, merchants, and travelers. It enriched brothel owners, tavern keepers, and landlords. It drew on the human flow of the empire's vast slave system, importing women and men from distant lands to serve in its chambers. It fed into literature, art, and public entertainment, where prostitutes could be objects of humor, lust, or even admiration, depending on the teller's perspective. It inspired poets and scandalized moralists, stood as a symbol of both urban vitality and moral decline. But behind the paintings, poems, and public performances were real people. For the majority, prostitution was a life of vulnerability, exposure to disease, violence, and exploitation with little legal protection. The infamia stamped on their legal status closed doors that could never fully reopen. Yet many found ways to navigate this world, forming communities, cultivating loyal clients, or even leveraging their beauty and intelligence to achieve influence far beyond what the law allowed. In a society obsessed with hierarchy and status, they lived in the margins, yet remained essential to the city's rhythm. As the centuries passed, Rome's moral compass shifted. The rise of Christianity reframed prostitution as a spiritual problem rather than a civic utility. Brothels closed, laws tightened, and the image of the prostitute transformed from a lively figure in public life to a symbol of sin in need of redemption. What had once been a legal and visible profession became increasingly hidden, surviving in the shadows of the medieval world. The pragmatic acceptance of the early empire gave way to moral absolutism, but the demand for sex work, as history has shown in every era, never disappeared. The story of prostitution in ancient Rome is not just a story about sex. It is a story about power, economics, gender, and the ways societies negotiate between what they permit and what they condemn. It is about the human capacity to adapt to systems that exploit, to carve out small spaces of agency in worlds that often deny it. It is about the paradox of a city that built laws to regulate prostitution, yet ensured those who practiced it could never fully belong. 2,000 years later, the voices of these women and men are faint, preserved in inscriptions, in the lines of poets, in the brushstrokes of ancient frescoes. But they remind us that history is not only made by generals, emperors, and senators. It is also made by those whose lives played out in the back rooms of brothels, the shadows of alleyways, and the private chambers of the powerful. Their existence shaped the Rome we read about today, even if their names have been forgotten. And so, as the empire's marble temples crumbled and its armies faded, one truth endured. The story of Rome is incomplete without the story of those who lived and worked in its most intimate trade, the ones who, in their own way, were part of the city's heart, its contradictions, and its legacy.
Good night and peaceful dreams.